Capital Markets Regulator fixes what is not broken. Centralization conflicts with competitive, dynamic regulation. Advocates for centralized financial regulation have met their match in Canada. She is proof that competition between intranational jurisdictions can foster thriving capital markets. In the policy paper I wrote with Daniel Duarte in September 2019, The Federal Takeover of Canada's Capital Markets, I argued that the decades-long push for a national securities regulator was a solution in search of a problem. It still is, and fortunately, COVID-19 distracted the federal government from completing the initiative, for now. Contrary to the claims of proponents, a national regulator would make markets less harmonious and more bureaucratic, the opposite of what Canada needs. The public choice explanation, one derived from self-interest, points to the regulator being a power grab for Ottawa and a market cartelization favoring Toronto over Calgary and Montreal. A successful local light approach. Canada is distinct among developed countries in that she does not have a national securities regulator akin to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. Each province and territory has its own capital markets overseer that issues guidelines and enforces sanctions. Yet there is coordination. In 2003, the 13 jurisdictions voluntarily created the Canadian Securities Administrators, CSA, to harmonize their policies. Since 2008, the CSA has had a passport system whereby one can register with a province and access the rest of the country's capital markets, except Ontario. It has its own process and is leading the charge for the federal scheme. Even without a national regulator, several federal prohibitions and approval procedures constrain capital markets in the name of national security and Canadian culture. The 1985 Investment Canada Act, amended in 2013, empowers the federal government to forbid foreign investments of significant size. For cultural industries, the thresholds are $5 million for direct acquisitions and $50 million for indirect acquisitions. Canada's relatively decentralized approach has harbored diverse capital markets, including derivatives, and the first all-digital exchange in North America. Amid a barrage of negative economic developments, the evolution of sophisticated Canadian capital markets has been impressive. The junior mining sector, in particular, has gravitated towards listing in Canada on the TSX Venture Exchange and the Canadian Securities Exchange. Depending on how you define them, there are a dozen public exchanges in Canada, as listed by Thomson Reuters Practical Law. About half of them are U.S. subsidiaries, and then there are about a dozen more alternative trading systems. These are less regulated intermediary markets. However, the Toronto Stock Exchange towers over the rest with a market capitalization of $3.8 trillion. Some jurisdictions, such as Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, do not have their own public exchanges. However, even at lower volumes, their regulators approve all those who trade, advise, underwrite, and manage securities from within their jurisdictions. These provincial and territorial regulators have been willing participants in CSA-coordinated regulations and the passport system. Central planners on the offensive. A publicly stated desire for a national securities regulator dates back at least as far as 1935. To the credit of Canada's courts and her common law and constitutional traditions, these initiatives have largely failed. The draft of the Capital Markets Stability Act, pending approval since 2016, seeks to create a new national overseer to supervise, collect data, and sanction participants. Given the federal government's spotty record with protecting data, this heightens rather than relieves concerns. In late 2018, Ottawa's push for top-down regulation culminated in a major Supreme Court decision. Provinces and territories, quote, were allowed under Canada's Constitution to delegate their respective authority to regulate securities to a single regulator, unquote. As with the Canada Pension Plan, opting in seems easy, but extricating oneself from the federal system once entangled would be another matter altogether. As a response, the Cooperative Capital Markets Regulatory System, CCMR, emerged, and every province and territory had the chance to opt in. British Columbia, Ontario, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Newfoundland and Labrador, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Yukon decided to join the effort. Alberta and Quebec were the major holdouts. They challenged the CCMR in court and refused to participate. The Capital Markets Authority Implementation Organization, CMAIO, was the one greasing the wheels for the CCMR until January 2022, when participating governments dissolved it. The response to COVID-19 and securities legislation reforms in some provinces delayed the development of CCMR legislation. According to its website, the CMAIO completed all possible integration work pending the completion of the legislation. Years of federal lobbying and lawfare had not come cheap. Founded in 2015, the CMAIO operated with Canadian taxpayer money, a war chest of $100 million. A solution in search of a problem. With the exception of Ontario, which appears to want to dominate the other provinces, there already is self-initiated harmonization between Canada's subnational governments via the CSA passport system. Rather than starting an uncertain federal scheme from scratch, a more productive endeavour would be to work out an arrangement to include Ontario in the functioning provincial system. One argument for a national regulator is that it would elevate Canada internationally and attract investors. However, the Fraser Institute's Freedom of the World ranking gives Canadian financial regulation near perfect scores and has done so for decades. The ranking does warn of red tape such as administrative requirements, licensing restrictions, and tax compliance. The most compelling explanation for the proposed federal body, which will likely be revived soon, is regulatory capture from Toronto and social engineering from Ottawa. This is a typical Baptists and bootleggers alliance. It aligns two different parties, one motivated by economic self-interest, Toronto, and the other by moralistic emotional satisfaction, Ottawa. Their success would come at the expense of provincial competition and constituent-driven policies. In an industry undergoing creative destruction away from centralization and bureaucracy, Ottawa officials are pushing in the opposite direction.